Welcome to Primordial Tao, Present Tao, a podcast about all things Taoism.
Welcome to Primordial Tao, Present Tao. This is episode 15. Who needs therapeutic Qi Gong? Well, hello again, Mike.
Good day, sir. How are you?
I'm doing good. I'm saying hello again because we just filmed the last podcast like 15 minutes ago.
Yep. Yeah. Oh, I was hoping we were gonna pretend that didn't happen, but I guess the cat's out of the bag. So, what do you want now?
Hello again, listeners. Or I guess hello, listeners. We're shifting gears a little bit for this particular podcast, and we're getting into the therapeutic nature of Qigong, um, which I love, to be honest, and uh, I believe is a profound need in our world. So I'm pretty excited for the conversation that we're about to kind of move forward with. And take it away, Mike.
Well, I mean, I could be funny and just say, well, all Qigong is therapeutic in some context. So just practice. And all right, we're out. Thanks for the show. Bye.
Mhm.
Good
All right,
job.
yeah. Um, but yeah, hopefully it gets a little bit more in depth than just that.
Yeah.
Um, I guess I'll start with my experience of some of this stuff, having been gone through this therapeutic Qigong course sometime last year, I believe. Yeah. And so, Mike, you have a specific way you teach this, you have a framework, you have a process, and uh, it's pretty smart, I would say, and it works pretty well. So, um, yeah, where did you wanna kick this thing off with?
Well, if people have heard the previous episode, we were talking about the I Ching Ching or the muscle tendon change and the its predecessor Dao Yin, in the sense of what early Qigong and other embodiment practices are about, in the tangible sense of how you feel into your body, what's happening in there. Although we were talking in that context more about developing a certain capacity that happens within the tissue body around strength and longevity and the molecules that make up collagen and how all kinds of crazy things happen when you can train the body in a way that is clearly a latent capacity of animal tissues and bodies and nervous systems. But within that conversation of, say, training in the warrior context to be more efficient and effective, there's also an aspect of the history of these practices that has to do with the fact that up until very recently, you probably would have had to defend your village against bandits, or protect your chickens from some thief in your barn, up until very recently, in the sense of living somewhere where you have a standing army of police and ambulances and fire trucks to solve problems, right? Because we have police because we need protection. We have ambulances because people have accidents, get old, sick, or die. We have fire trucks because people need fire to make most of their lives work, especially up until, electrical grids were in place. So there was fires. So, we've always needed what you might call a social immune system. And a part of that in many traditions that include embodiment and breath work and movement and range of motion, strength, all of those kind of things, also are aware that certain experiences of life will cause you to flinch or to cringe or to hold some kind of fighting stance, at least on the level of emotion.
Right.
Um, Even just the process of going from child to adolescent to adult, somewhat of a metamorphosis, caterpillar to butterfly. So this way we experience embodied or somatic instinct and intuition and adaptability, the way we become who we are, is determined by what we move through.
Hmm.
So let's say up until recently, we've all had to have experiences that were traumatic enough to leave an imprint in our experience, in our embodiment, in our somatic self. So one way that this happens is because our most of our body as meridians, as connective tissue, is made up of something we call fascia. And there's a lot of layers and aspects of that. But what's important to be aware of from any point of view, from martial arts to just Qigong practice to actually healing, something that needs to change is that your fascia is almost as sensitive as your skin,
Hmm.
right? So if I was to, and pardon the weird perhaps shift in context, but want to incite in my lover some excitement, and I'm, caressing, them with a feather or an ice cube or, some caress or, something that has to do with a range of sensation. It's that range of sensation that sometimes creates pleasure. Now, that's because we experience sensation as meaning. Like well, that's the context of a little bit of, flirty sensuality isn't offending anyone, but it's that idea that sense is information, information is meaning, meaning is in some ways a part of our state of being, but it's also becoming our story of who we are. So let's say, and this is probably going to be a somewhat triggering conversation, so I'm saying that now, but I'll probably bring it up a couple of other times. If you were punished as a child, in the tradition of Western culture, which is to throw a, small human across your lap and just slap them on the backside until they cry and, some, like training an animal domestication attempt to make them behave, which seems to be what people are trying to do. It's like trying to train a dog or something. Um, Perhaps that person is going to continue to feel a certain amount of guardedness, to have their back up, to maybe have a harder time dancing or moving in the sense of sexuality in certain ways because something defining about who they were was defined by a lot of pain in the sacral plexus, in the muscles and membranes of the lower body. Now, obviously, that would get much worse in any aspect of sexual violence.
Hmm.
Right? To maybe make this less, oh my God, and more, yeah, I've seen this every day, is people who are going to just yell at their kids, overbearingly, shamingly, with disappointment and expectations, and, you didn't, but you should have, and now you're bad, and yell, yell, yell. And you can see two things happen. One is the kid is flinching or cringing away from the loudness of the voice. So imagine you're doing that, kind of like, oh my God, that's so oppressive and relentless of an onslaught of, volume and even if I can't understand the words, I understand the emotional context of an overbearing yelling adult. Now, if I understand the words, I'm not only cowered in the corner going like, "Ah," I'm taking on an imprint of meaning. So now I'm 20 years later walking down the street and some car drives by and it, hits a nail and the tire explodes and there's a big bang. And then I go right back into that cringing fright state of there's some big dangerous thing coming towards me. I don't know what it is right now, but I remember what it was like to be in the corner of my bedroom when my parent was yelling at me and I'm just cowering up against the wall. So this is what we call implicit memory. And part of it is embodied, part of it is egoic, part of it is the structure of an identity. But now I'm formed and I feel and I carry a kind of meaning within everything that makes me flinch or cringe in that way. In fact, I'm actually on guard to either use that as a source of intuition or to avoid that because it's a source of I no longer, as a human being, am valid in my autonomy. Because anyone who could make me feel like that must be able to just turn my gears and, make me behave in the way that they want me to. So that's where the other track goes, which is children who have parents who try and domesticate them like an animal. And they say, I will do the opposite of everything you try and make me do until I'm free of your oppression.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's another thing and another thing and another thing. And that's more in the realm of psychotherapy, like tell the story, draw out the implicit memory, see the meaning, talk it through, feel it through, and then maybe rearrange how you interact with your life, the people in your life now as an adult, because you're aware you have this memory and it's either I must obey to avoid more pain, or I must refute and defy and say, screw you, you'll never make me. Ah. So we're never free in either of those two cases because we're just running a program.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But on that level of therapy and interaction, you can get a lot done through conversation, through contemplation, through journaling, through sitting with the feelings as they come up before they turn you into, version A or version screw you,
Mm-hmm.
and everything in between, right? So
Yep.
there's another way to look at this, which is more around Qigong practice, martial arts, Chinese medicine, acupuncture, and all of those things. And it is kind of a fun thing to think about. Or I try to use a thing that's a bit fun to use as an image. So imagine, if you will, that your body is somehow, in a way, the body of a teddy bear. And if you
Okay.
listen to the previous episode, we can say if you take a microscope and you poke it around the inside of fascia, it kind of looks a little bit like a stringy, weird sponge, the way the inside of a sponge or a teddy bear's kind of foam would look.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say that on the level of meridians, and the term Qing in Chinese for meridians is like the warp and weft of how a cloth is made. It's just 3 or 4 or 5 dimensional instead of, a tablecloth. And that the conduction of qi, the ability to have circulation and vitality and, all of that, is determined by how well circulation and information move. Now, we can call circulation and information qi or neurotransmitters or, micro blood supply or whatever. If we want to have something we can kind of put the idea or hang the idea on from a scientific point of view, or we can do the more symbolic, contextual way that Chinese medicine and Qigong use. The problem for Westerners, though, and this is sort of the colonization glitch, we think that everyone experiences the world the way we do. So when someone says, if your meridians are too tight or too atrophied or too stuck, your chi flow is inhibited. And in English, we think chi as energy as a thing in a place. Then we can kind of get stuck on the chi instead of, oh yeah, well, I need to open my fascia, I need to improve my circulation, I need to maybe self-regulate, down-regulate enough that the kinds of informational substances within the circulation of the body are optimized. Right. So we
Mm-hmm.
can kind of get stuck here a little bit. So I'm just leaving it up to the listener to decide how you want to frame it, but keep in mind the more literal and object orientated it is, the more that's an English language paradigm. The more contextual and kind of meh, not so worried about the specifics is closer to the way the Chinese language would have and still does operate.
Mm.
Because it's not as the two languages are different enough. So anyway, here we are in our strange little teddy bear bodies, as a way of seeing the fabric quality of the spongy, the resilience of our tissue. And now imagine as a teddy bear that at some point when you were born, by the necessity of having a personality, that personality is symbolized by being wrapped up in tinfoil. Now, depending on where you're from, that might be crunchy, used up tinfoil from a back alley behind, a fast food restaurant. If you're born with a silver or gold or platinum spoon in your mouth, maybe you can see some fine, the kind of gold filament they wrap around fancy food in restaurants, or however you want to frame the identity, the personality, the ego around the body is this tinfoil, this shiny metal, the solid identity. And in Chinese medicine, when we talk about metal, we're talking about uh, in one context, the energetic coalescence and gathering and more specific resources. Like, if you're harvesting vegetables in your garden, it's the same as isolating metal out of dirt. So metal, in a way, is a symbol of gathering abundance. but it's also representational of the solidity of the ego. And in spiritual practice, we want to dissolve that, with a certain amount of forthright imminence, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have some context here. Okay, we have the soil body, the foam, the kind of sort of inert thing, and within that foam, some things may move around. But wrapped around that foam is this very stiff material that, again, and this is a triggering, so FYI, here you are as a child being yelled at or punished or hit in some way or hurt in some way, which is going to crinkle up the tinfoil and squeeze the physical shape of the foam into a tighter, less spacious material, which is a way to describe how trauma impacts fascia. Be not specific to the chemistry or the neurotransmitters or the inflammation or the atrophy, but just in the sense of kind of like the shape. Because if I was to imitate someone cringing in the corner trying to avoid being hit from a broomstick because their grandma's meds didn't work out so well, or something, the thing I'm asking people to image is the dents that would be kind of somewhat permanent in the tinfoil.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So when we think of uh, Qigong in the therapeutic sense, especially around trauma or finding balance and movement and agility and good health and good circulation, step one is recognizing the body's innate nature is to be very much like soil, very diffuse, very open, very still, but also the medium through which all of your feelings and emotions and functions and movements and the aging process and how to be athletic or do anything changes, right? So we have the soil, but we could turn the soil into a tree. We can turn the soil into a tree that bears fruit, or flowers, which are like fire, in the sense of luminosity and radiance. So the soil of the body is something sacred. And in the old version of the five phases or the five elements, soil is in the middle, and the four dynamic elements are around it, kind of like what people think of as the medicine wheel, the four directions like a compass.
Yeah. And that makes a lot more sense because it kind of like it's like the soil on the ground on the earth that experiences the four seasons.
Mhm. Exactly. So if we want to take a moment and just pause without like pausing too much and recognize the most sacred thing we can do is to feel at home with a certain amount of stillness and a certain amount of permission for life to move around and before and beyond and through us in some way to experience it wholeheartedly, or maybe in a fulfilling way that still honors, each of us in our own way. We have to have practices that allow us to move towards sensations that are the opposite. Because you can't
Mm-hmm.
avoid healing something that's hurting you forever. I've tried it. Like, believe me, like I've done all the running, hiding for while I was drinking. Other times it was training so hard that I couldn't remember why I was training so hard to
Mm.
avoid the thing that I was trying to avoid. And that's true. I mean, I've been a clinician almost 30 years. That's mostly what most of us are doing is trying to avoid pain, avoid memories, either connect with people that can take care of us or connect with people that we can find some antagonistic screw you relationship with so that I can be defiant, right? But if we want to heal, well, none of that's actually true in the sense of capital T true. So how do I move towards practices that unwrinkle my tinfoil, that return my spongy inner soil body to the thing it was like when I was a baby? And that's like a kind of common quote in Taoist practice and Qigong is we eventually want to get back to the quality of moving and feeling our body like a baby. Like the highest level of breathing is embryonic breathing.
Like, yeah, like an
Right.
embryo.
Right? Or at least like an infant. So
Hmm.
given that we have these thousands of years of experience and wisdom and practice, sometimes it's a good idea before getting into the what, how, and why is just to look at life what is this embodied experience like? So the first thing, well, we got teddy bears and tinfoil. We have a somatic memory, and then we have the insults and assaults of life that kind of kinkle and wrinkle and compress and stretch out as striate or, ball up the way we feel as embodied beings. And that determines how we see the world, because that's what the world has turned us into. So given that that's sort of the overarching paradigm, when I think of therapeutic Qigong, I think of it as triage. Now, if you're not a clinician or you don't watch certain kinds of movies or whatever, you probably don't know what triage is. So triage is, let's assume that there's a big bus accident on the highway and the first aid people, the ambulance people, fire truck people, whoever show up, their job is to figure out the order in which people need help. Or the people who aren't going to make it through this, and we should probably find a way to make them as comfortable as we can because they're not going to maybe get to the hospital anyway. Right, so this is triage, and I think we all have that natural inclination in our lives when we come home from work even. Like, do I want to do the dishes, or do I want to make food, or do I want to drink half a bottle of whiskey before I even consider whether or not I want to eat any food because my day has been that kind of a day? And so we're always doing that kind of damage control kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
So if we were to look at Qigong as a part of the way we live our lives, and we wanted to teach people some practices that could help them maybe smooth out their tinfoil and restore their happy little teddy bear bodies in the sense of meridians and chi flow and stuff like that. The first thing we need to do for most people is make sure that they can come out of a panic attack. I don't know if you've ever had a panic attack.
I think I've had weeks of panic attacks.
Right. So if you've ever had a panic attack, you know what it's like to lose your proverbial poop. Right. So now who is the one doing Qigong? Who is the one meditating? Who is the one deciding what to make for dinner or drink so you don't have to make anything for dinner? So if we're in shock or in some ratio of panic attack, we're not the one driving the vehicle of decision making. We're just getting through each breath if we're still able to breathe.
Yeah, that's some real talk right there.
Yeah. So when we teach this course to people, which is for Qigong practitioners, Qigong teachers, clinicians, anyone who might want to have a very comprehensive approach to dealing with trauma in their Qigong practice or just in their life, that's got to be something we all know how to do. And if you're not there and you go through those practices, it's not like you're going to fall asleep or you're going to suddenly trigger something. You're just going to be, shifting your state in a way that's pretty thorough because you were having a good day anyway. But if you're not having a good day, in fact, you're barely even having a day, the capacity to come down from a panic attack or come out of shock is the essential first thing to do. And I just want to throw this out there. The word shock is used clinically, in a way for people that are, a couple of minutes to maybe a couple of hours after something terrifying or terrible has happened, car accident, whatever. People who live with PTSD, complex PTSD, certain volumes of chronic pain, lack of sleep, profound dysfunction in social connection and stuff like that. Their whole life is a varying background music of shock. It's more of a question of what volume of shock am I experiencing today? And sometimes because I work with my patients in that trauma specific way a lot, and that's the first question I'll ask them because they're going to have a conversation. We're going to talk about do's and don'ts, or we're going to do some acupuncture or something else, maybe do some qigong. That's the first question. What volume of shock are you experiencing today? Now that volume can mean volume like how loud your stereo is in the sense of this screaming of shock, or the volume can mean like how many, I don't know, barrels full of shock are you, carrying on your back.
Mm-hmm.
So however we want to image that out, it's just a good discussion to start with, especially before your personal practice. Like, what volume of shock am I experiencing? Is the shock feeling like something eating me from behind? Is it a big empty space in my solar plexus? Is the butterflies in my stomach? This is my personal favorite, turned into pterodactyls with machine guns trying to, punch holes in my spine and my heart and my soul, like whatever, funny imagery we have. That's like the volume of shock.
Right.
So if we can come down from shock, come out of the kind of panic attack part, then we can begin this other conversation, which is the process of actually down regulation. So now you're not in shock or dissipated or kind of locked up anymore in the sense of panic attack and shock. Now it's kind of like landing a helicopter. Now, depending on the weather, imagine you're in a city and you're trying to land a helicopter on a movie because maybe you're triaging some accident that's happened because you're the rescue first aid helicopter person because, it is therapeutic Qi Gong after all.
Mhm.
So is it a hurricane? Is it a windstorm? Is it a snowstorm? Is there hail? Is it so full of smoke because of some explosion that you can't see where you're landing? There's all kinds of metaphors for the landing of a helicopter. But on a metabolic neurotransmitter stress hormone level, it takes most people, if not everyone, at least 20 minutes to go from a hypervigilant, adrenalized shock state into an adaptive present. I could actually probably digest food, have a laugh, and feel my body objectively state.
And you're talking like clinically, biochemically when you say that, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, as a clinician, that's usually how we frame things in the sense of volume, like volume of, say, cortisol and catecholamines or adrenaline and stuff like that, that are flooding the person's body.
Hmm.
No, here's a weird analogy, and it's kind of a funny story. So years and years and years ago, someone gave me this book called The 5 Rules or 7 Rules for Making a Marriage Work. Unfortunately, I got the book 3 months after I was divorced, so it was, and it's a very small book because it's very common sense. But the author, who is one of the world's best researchers and clinicians around relationship stability and health, he uses this word flooded. Because if you're flooded with adrenaline, the volume of shock and distress on a measurable chemical hormone level is so high when you come home and you want to have a conversation with your partner, because it's a book on marriage, and your Qigong practice is kind of like a marriage. His advice is if you come home and you're flooded, or you see that your partner's flooded in the sense of stressed out, you just need to lie down, maybe with a cool towel on your head, not looking at your phone, not listening to music, not watching TV, so that your nervous system has no stimulus. So your body can wind down, land a helicopter in a way where you're actually you again. And then you might go and have that talk with your partner as to, whatever the thing that's up needs to be met. Because if you're interacting with anyone, including yourself, from a flooded place, you're in your least adaptive capacity. You're basically, I mean, the idea of a lizard brain is somewhat, I don't know, urban myth in the literal sense, but if you're basically adrenalized enough that you're in your lizard brain, you don't have a lot of, you could say your dictionary for language is 5 or 6 words.
Yeah, and from like experience having conversations from that state, um, it just gets wrapped up in further more of that. Like
Yeah,
there's really no resolution. The only thing that's gonna happen is you're gonna create more arguments.
yeah. So if we can recognize that this downregulation, landing the helicopter in the storm, is something that's going to be sort of the next step. As we do that downregulation part, it gets more and more subjective or more and more personal, depending on how you embody dysregulation, how familiar you are with feeling into, maybe imitating and then releasing the way you embody distress. And there's a thing called progressive relaxation that's sort of a big part of trauma therapy, embodied trauma therapy, where you actually kind of draw a cartoon of yourself, in your mind or on a piece of paper, about how you would look and feel when you're really stressed out. And use that, we call it a samatha map, to guide you in your Qigong practice, or you take it into your acupuncturist or massage therapist and say, this is how my Qi looks on the inside. This is how my body feels when I'm really wound up. I need to unwind. I need to downregulate. But in order to downregulate, I have to notice I'm dysregulated. And I'm kind of contracting or cringing the proverbial tinfoil around my teddy bear, or it's just collapsed and melted on the floor and there's no structure to any part of me anymore. So what do I need to do to get back to regulation, to release in that way? And that's very, very personal. But that's step two is if you're not in shock, you can do something that has a sequence. If you can do something with a sequence in the metaphor of Qigong exercises, now you want to downregulate and land in your body, land in your breath, land in the moment, connect with things as they are, and then recognize, oh yeah, I just came out of shock. What would any animal do that just came out of the mouth of another animal and survived?
They shake.
They shake, they twitch, they freak out, but they're also on scanning the horizon like a submarine with a periscope sticking out of it for the next thing that might happen. So now that we're in our body, more or less, helicopter landed, shock abated. Oh yeah, I'm probably hypervigilant AF because oh my God, I just got through what now? So now down regulation becomes this just very gentle process, which is kind of like landing the helicopter on the inside or dropping the periscope of what else could go wrong. And there's ways to do that through standing practice, seated practice, lying practice, through state shift practice. But at first, we need to break the state. We need to get out of hypervigilance. We need to recognize that, holy crap, I was not okay, like in whatever way. And now I'm getting close to feeling back in my body. Oh, yeah, I'm still looking for the next thing that could go wrong. Or I'm looking for the next thing that's supposedly wrong with me, which is a never-ending, story of things we can make up about what's wrong with us.
Mhm. So, obviously this would be like an estimation, but like what percentage of the population do you think is kind of just like in these states like most of the time?
Oh, most of us. I mean, it's contextual too. I mean, I guess I'm speaking in when I say most of us, I'm thinking about our birthright capacity to be in our autonomy, 2 seconds away from dancing, 2 seconds away from playing, right? 2 seconds away from allowing kids to just take over the afternoon and, have fun because connection, community, and collaboration has been the status quo up until the industrialization and domestication of humans. So when I think about, dysregulated people, I think of people walking around with a furrowed brow and a forward-leaning intensity and an agenda and a list to do. And if I don't get through everything today, I'm a failure and it's going to lose me money and then I'm going to have this other problem. So I'm trying to whip myself into the frenzy of activity with a hypervigilant periscope of consequences all the time. That's just day-to-day life. For me, that's like going mildly insane, but for most people, that's just a good day with a couple of, shots of espresso and an action item list. So I guess you could say it's relative to
Hmm.
what a healthy embodiment would be. So on a certain level, everybody's in a little bit of shock because we're sort of in this self-domestication sacrifice modus operandi of, what do they call the Judeo-Christian ethic of work yourself down to the bone in this life and you'll be happy in heaven.
Hmm.
Yeah. So anyway, so it depends on what your relative definition of needs to, downregulate and, what hypervigilance may or may not be in the crisis sense or in the chronic sense.
Hmm.
So we
So
can go ahead, sorry.
yeah, so okay, so we come out of our shock state, and then we're still looking around for danger, hypervigilance, we calm all that down. And so now we're actually in our body and yeah, we're feeling pretty good. So what's the next step here?
Well, the next step is to ask ourselves, what's the next step if we didn't? So if I'm hypervigilant, anxious, projecting, self-shaming, and I come home and maybe I'm not in crisis in the sense of shock, I guess in the like emergency sense, what is the most likely thing for most people to do when they're just really uncomfortable, unhappy, stressed out, and probably mildly depressed at the meaning of all of this?
Sounds like a good glass of wine would do the trick.
right? And that's the second thing that we seek in trauma as it goes deeper is comfort seeking, which is gateway to addiction. And that's because we've forgotten how to shift our state. Now, if we all remember that we all come from cultures that had ceremony, singing, rattling, drumming, part of my background being First Nations, I think of sweat lodges and uh, other ways for people to like shake off the proverbial willies and really move towards something coherent, in the sense of healing or warriorship or intentionality. Right. But in the modern sense, yeah, a glass of wine, put on some, Netflix and chill or eat a bunch of biochemically disorienting things to stop me from feeling what I was feeling, and now I'm just feeling something else. And so when we recognize that comfort seeking is a need, the next thing that I encourage people to do, and the way I usually teach clinicians about this, is to really get good at state shift through progressive relaxation. Right. So if you can imitate your tension, you can deconstruct the way that it actually forms up in your membranes. So if I was to
Hmm.
imitate my teddy bear on a bad day in the way that the tinfoil might be holding my shoulders and neck and solar plexus together, as an example, now as I imitate it, I can feel the addition of constraint and the places I feel collapsed. And in being able to imitate those things, I can imitate them in slow motion backwards, right? So I don't know if you're
Hmm.
familiar with the term hackles.
We've had this discussion before, so yes, I never
Yeah.
used to be, but
Yeah. So hackles is when an animal's hair stands up on end. So let's just call one part of the stress response hackles. Now I come
mhm.
home and my hackles are up. I probably don't want to talk to my partner until I've lied down for 20 minutes, or I might delude myself into thinking that, using some chemical to disorient myself in some other way is going to get my hackles down. And maybe it will in a superficial way, but it hasn't really released the distress, the story, the event that put my hackles up. So if I can imitate hackles up, I can imitate slowly hackles down.
Right. And we kind of get into the process of like, this is like, I guess, a shift of instead of trying to move away from the pain, now we're kind of moving towards it.
Yeah, and that shifts our paradigm from just pain to understanding a quality of the experience we have in Qigong around Qi. And this is a funny thing to say, but the mind and body meet in sensation. Between the sky and the land, there are Qi and its kind of dynamic, laws or rules like the five phases, there are five elements, right? So if between heaven and earth, the sky and land, there is chi, between the mind and body, there is sensation, which is how you feel chi. It's also how you feel pain and morose, emotions and shame and guilt and resentment and bitterness, and because they're feelings, we feel sensation. So what would happen if we could come out of shock, land the helicopter, down-regulate our hackles through progressive relaxation, come into state through state shift bit by bit. Still learning about that in the most general kind of on-off sense. But I want to maybe get good at sensing sensation. And this is where the qi, the sensing in and appreciating and assessing qi balls and the qi of your meridians and the qi of the weather of the day, the feng shui of your living room or your backyard or wherever you're practicing, whether or not you might want to practice close to graveyards or not, or other things in the sense that we want to learn to sense into our sensations. We want to become a connoisseur of chi sensation instead of wine and, chemistry that makes us just sort of disappear. Because that's the thing with comfort seeking is you don't want to feel anything if you can get away with it. Or you just want to feel something good if you can get away with that. But as a connoisseur of chi, let's say you can move towards both the challenging, uncomfortable, perhaps painful sensations, knowing that that's the way to move through them towards the actual autonomy, well-being, resourced, adaptive, in your body, as yourself for yourself.
Mm-hmm. And the
And
word that
that takes
comes up,
practice. Go ahead, sorry.
the word that comes up for me is resilience.
Yeah. Right. But that's on the level of sensation. You can feel how resilient you are. It's like if I walk into a conversation that's going to be tricky, one of the first things I do is go, am I actually in my adaptive resilience enough to deal with this right now? Or am I going to have to, say if it's a very insane, busy clinic day and I'm barely keeping up, I might have to deflect from that kind of interaction with someone because I'm not in the moment, in the room with that person enough to go into that.
Mm-hmm.
Or I might have to just be like, I just need to go to the washroom. I'll be right back. And I don't actually go to the washroom. I just go to this space in the back of my clinic and do a couple of the Qigong things that land helicopters and, get you out of state. So I can actually sit in a room with someone and just be attention,
Mm.
right? So there's a lot of ways that this can go. But as long as we can learn to regulate our experience and choose to feel what we're feeling, then we can become more effective or efficient or specific or articulate, or subtle or skillful.
Yeah, I like how you talk about like tasting the flavors.
Yeah. So one other way we can play with this is exploring and imitating and investigating the wuxing or the five phases of transformation, or what we call the five elements. I don't really like the word elements because that's a physical object, not a state of being, not a quality of nature. An element is something you can put in a box.
So you usually use the term five phases, right? Or is there a better
Mhm.
word to describe that?
Wuxing works great, but
Whooshing.
gonna need to take a look at the Chinese characters to recognize it's a description about being at a crossroads and being skillful in how you move.
Mm.
So it's also like just a way of appreciating nature has this kind of intermediate uh, reality we live in, and then there's the four extremes of the seasons. Which in the shamanic traditions, we say as above, so below. So, of course, the inner experience of our body can be experienced as a reflection of the world around us. So maybe if I really get good at imitating the chi of water and wood and metal and fire and soil, you could say I'm really developing a palate. Now, I did this thing years ago when I went to a wine tasting class where they gave us a bunch of different tiny little glasses of wine to sniff and swish around and smell and taste and, oaky this, cherry that, pepper, whatever, because you're developing a palate for what you might experience tasting wine. Now, fun as that might have been, it's a similar relationship when you want to become very aware of the qualities, not the quantities, but the qualities of qi. Because within the season of, say, spring, which we're coming into right now we're in, one of the phases of the energy of spring as it moves through a 3 month process in which, 5 or 6 or 7 different measurable shifts of state or nuances of connoisseur appreciation happen. So when we get to be aware that, oh yeah, if I want to be good at sensation, maybe I want to just take some time as I'm learning to sense into sensation, to feel what the senses and sensations of reality, nature, the seasons are, which correlate because of early shamanic uh, paradigms, as above, so below, which encompasses Chinese medicine as well. Now, if I want to play with my liver, which relates to the chi of spring, which relates to all these senses and interactions and qualities, now I can become my healthy liver chi by imitating the qualities I can see in growing plants and the quality of spring, and on and on and on. Now, the same thing happens when we start moving deeper into the seasons and the makeup of the inner landscape, which you might call the three selves, the three dantian, the six minds, the different things that we can get into when we start kind of mapping out our inner terrain. again, for qualities of sensation, qualities of meaning, because kind of need to do that to develop that palate, that connoisseur of what it's like to be you from the inside out.
Yeah, I wrote down permission just to feel what is.
Yeah, but given that there's these maps that are thousands of years old around, dantians and innate minds and perhaps meridians and other things, we could go with just feel what is, or we could say I could feel what is within the nature of the parts of me that reside in and are expressed through my lower dantian, my middle dantian, my upper dantian. So there's teachings and stories and ways to appreciate that so we can move towards it and become more nuanced in appreciating, or perhaps you could say, like as a clinician, charting what you're looking at and dealing with. I'm in shock, I'm not in shock. And then, now we have a map or a terrain to work with. Now, the same is true, and I usually am pretty light with this the first time people go through it, is to actually appreciate and sense into the primary qi wounds that we see in Chinese medicine. Now, your qi can be sinking too much, it could be escaping too much, it could be stuck too much in the sense of shock. It can be adversarial too much, it could be constrained too much, it could be collapsed too much. Or you could say any of those qualities could be not enough. So as we kind of imitate and play around with the kind of qi wounds that happen that produce illness, that can happen on the level of a kind of emotional bias that we have that holds our qi in a certain quality or a certain state. Or we can look at the actual metaphor of qi circulation being like in a anxious, uptight way, like, we say your belt meridian is squeezing your gallbladder and liver to the point where, you're just wearing yourself out because you're just squeezing because you're uptight. Right. And there's qi ni, the most common thing is just to be adversarial against and pushy. And sometimes we do that even against ourselves. So when we can appreciate the palette of what's in nature, appreciate the palette of a way of understanding our embodied experience, and appreciate the palette of the most common ways we experience too much or not enough of the things that make us sick. Now we can begin a more proactive and organized therapeutic approach to our well-being. And again, this is mostly symbolic stuff from, culture that didn't have access to microscopes or measuring stress hormones and neuropeptides out of the blood or other things. So it's couched in symbols and metaphor to a degree, but it's still the most efficient map on Earth. So, it does overlap with the science bits in a way, but it doesn't need any of that to be effective.
Yeah. Which map are you talking about exactly?
Like meridians and organs and dantians and qi wounds and all of that, the stuff that comes from Taoist practice, Chinese medicine.
Yeah, cool.
And then there's this thing I like to do around that point in the training with people, which is, this has been really pretty much kind of like mined down into the body, or traumatic experience that's held in the body, or how as an emotionally heart-centered person to meet the constraints and conditions and catastrophes of your life with a kind of spiritual warriorship. But people also have car accidents. We train, say, in martial arts and get boo-boos. I think of myself, I almost died rock climbing or rock falling, and it's been over a year to get back to where I could train properly again because of the damage. And so we do take some time in the therapeutic training to actually study like physical therapy, Qigong. Specifically, there's an approach to Qigong that's like to help people come back into their bodies after a stroke or coming out of a coma. For some people who've been in profound shock, coming into their body is like coming out of a coma. People who've had catastrophic injuries need to do kind of physiotherapy just for the sake of range of motion, biomechanics, stuff like that. It also gives people going through that process because we have 10 months to basically learn and experience and transform through this whole thing, just to learn the practices, right? So during that process, it's kind of you could call it a bit of a generous gift of pause and interlude and intermission to slow how deep we go with what could be the source of, you know, woundedness or illness and need healing with just some good fashioned biomechanics, some really clear approaches to how to physically open the tissue of the body, how to organize your mechanics, how to get a little bit stronger, how does flexibility actually work? Like if you want to build up a better healthy relationship with your body, then you want to do that through just good physicality, like physical education.
Mm-hmm.
And it
Yeah.
slows down the intensity of what else am I going to, Pandora's box, what else in the you know, repressed memory trauma places in there. You don't just keep popping that thing open every day. It's nice to say, oh, I'm actually getting pretty good at this. I'm going to work on the basic stuff of just being fit, healthy, flexible, and have good alignment and to feel the resilience in the just day-to-day sense of being in your body, not what else could be wrong.
Mm. Yeah, what I really appreciated about that particular course was uh was actually the Q&A.
Mhm.
The group of Q&A and just having that container that we were like allowed to talk about this stuff, and there were such like so many like deep compassionate conversations that now I have for like the rest of my life, I guess, as long as I don't
Mhm.
lose my little hard drive there.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that was another, I think it was a key piece of the whole training was like just to be able to ask questions about the things that we were feeling.
Mhm. And nothing gives, human beings, which are very social animals, permission to experience some things that we've been repressing by watching other people experience similar, if not the same things.
Yeah, because a lot of the time somebody would say something and it'd be like, oh my God, I'm going through the exact same thing, but that person is saying it. And it's like, okay, we're actually doing this together. It's like, I'm not alone in all of this.
Yeah, and that's also why I often in those Q&As and in almost every Q&A I'm in, I'll sometimes say, okay, I'm going to leapfrog off of this question and have a little conversation with everyone about this whole part of practice, this whole part of life, this whole thing about trauma or addiction, or I don't know, even how your cell receptors might be the problem, in some way or something like that, so that we can collaboratively in a shared way move towards a sort of solution-minded appreciation of things while also being willing to stop, sit, and embrace what it is we're experiencing. Because we don't always need to solve everything. Sometimes at first we just need to be with something.
Hmm.
And that brings us to the next part of the practice, which is, well, now you know, I often use the metaphor of Oscar the Grouch from Sesame Street. We're holding the trauma in this little container, and we're obviously strong enough for what's in the container if we can hold it down. So at first, we're just learning to take the lid off and invite Oscar to come out and join the team because
Hmm.
it's not pathological. Uh, Energy isn't pathological in its own nature. It just turns into something pathological when it's not met in a healing way. So if we can throw the lid away, through all the trauma release practice, come back into our body through the more Liangong, like exercise, flexibility, structure alignment practices. Now we're familiar with ourselves in both ways. We're embodied in some degree of confidence, or at least patience in both ways. Because the next
Hmm.
step is called Ting Jin, which means to learn to listen with your whole body and being, all aspects of your awareness to what is arising within the tissue of your body,
Yeah, I
within
really,
the resonant sensescape of smell and sound and sight around you, but to reach into it to get a slightly more let's say, accurate or complete sense of what you're sensing.
hmm.
But you have to have a certain, call it, insane courage of like, well, I keep opening Oscar the Grouch's lid, and now I'm opening Pandora's box's lid. And by listening deeply to my sensations and what's coming up from the unconscious place, I'm kind of asking for it, but I'm also kind of ready for it. And what if this is good? Like, what if I don't have any other, I don't know, skeletons in the proverbial closet of my skeleton? Or what if I do? And I now have the practice, the experience, the skill set, and the just residence in my body to find out.
Hmm.
So once we've learned that capacity of listening, you could say that's like the ability to be in the eye of the hurricane, but to reach into the hurricane just to see if there's any flying cows and road signs that are going to come at your head. I always like that. My favorite part of hurricane movies is the flying cows and road signs. That's a great metaphor for meditating and realizing, oh my God, something's really up here. Because I'm
Hmm.
not meditating, I'm watching the action movie of, embodied trauma kind of coming out of the body into the scape of imagination and storytelling.
Right, and like we use that sign with the hand looping
Yeah.
in the head. Yeah, it's kind of like a little hurricane in there.
Yeah. So when we get into that place, then we want to move into certain aspects of alignment and posture and meditation and stillness so that we're getting very practiced at being the center of the pupil of the eye of the hurricane. To also come into the immediacy of now. And I'm leaving a pregnant pause there because the immediacy of now is to stop. Stop responding, stop reacting, stop producing, stop defining, stop refining, stop stopping. So that we can actually come into the ecstatic reunion of, oh my God, I'm just a part of a living world. I'm not separate. I'm not, trying to fit in again after being damaged in some way. I implicitly belong to the universe, as the universe, for the universe, and as an expression and a point of awareness of all of that. Hmm, maybe I could, be okay with the fact I'm mostly okay, but I've got a few, little wounds and a few little, imbalances and a few other things that now I can begin relating to in a gradual, happy, almost hygiene-like process. Yeah, in Chinese, the way we look at this translates to like hygiene, in a way. And now we're we're reforming and redefining and refining and repairing the teddy bear foam, the meridian matrix, the way qi originates and moves through all aspects of physiology and all aspects of circulation, all aspect of communication and information, and all of the things that are happening between 70 trillion cells that make up you, which are also happening based on how the environment's bumping into your genes and how your genes are bumping back. Right. So
Hmm.
now we're in there really doing some measurable healing because we're redefining how your genes express themselves. Because you're not running on reaction hormones, you're now moving with state-specific orientations to the world that definitely determine your hormones and neurotransmitters, but they also start to change the defining who is the one practicing. Because now you're not in the middle of a slow motion car accident. You're perhaps, steering the wheel or sailing the sailing ship with your keel deep in the water, navigating the ocean of life without fear, without reaction, without some sense there's something wrong with you. You're just refining and redefining what coherence and health are,
Hmm.
kind of moment by moment, bit by bit. And then I like to take another little detour at this point in the practice because now we're learning to be resilient and coming from the source of who we are, our authenticity, our autonomy. It takes some time to get used to being okay. Confidence is interesting because it's really only confidence when you're really comfortable. Confidence doesn't really look like confidence when you're out there manically trying to make up for insecurities, but that's the first person you're going to see who seems confident because they're running around doing whack-a-mole to prove themselves to everyone.
Yeah, it's funny. I know the first like few times that I actually felt peace, the first thing I did was like run into something to make me not feel at peace.
Yeah, well, there's an age-old story there, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So at that point, I usually spend some time doing core toning and other kinds of grounding and floor work and things that allow us to actually just appreciate what it's like to really refine the connections across the body, uh,
Mm-hmm.
to really feel a kind of agility, a kind of animal like crouch and pounce. It's the same thing that happens when you're dancing, playing sports and stuff is we reside in a trusting agility and capacity of the body around movement and, stuff like that, which is always limited by your core tone. Like you could have the biggest arm strength and calf muscles in the world, but if you have no core tone, if you try to use your big calf muscles and your arm muscle, you just basically probably dislocate your vertebrae,
Mm.
or, something like that. So it is, in the sense of therapeutic benefit, overall health, a good idea to take that little detour and spend some time just making sure we can all, engage our core, we can all move, we can all twist, we can all bend. And it's also in a way a somatic metaphor for like, bring it on. I do want to play sports, or I do want to go dancing, or I do want to feel agility and uh, just a kind of comfortable competence within the way we move, with our body.
Mm-hmm.
And then we start going into this idea that, well, if we can do these state breaks and state shifts and land helicopters and, reorient ourselves in all these different ways, what happens when we start inducing state shift in a way to loosen ourselves up a little bit? And, we do that with breath work. It's pretty easy to use breath work to kind of, what does Wim Hof say? Get high on your own supply. I mean, the objective here isn't to get high. It's to shift the I don't know, status quo of your circulation, your neurotransmitters, your Jing Qi and Shen, depending on how you want to look at it, so that what's possible and what's probable gets a lot looser. What's allowed to happen, in the sense of the shamanic parts of practice, what we're allowed to play with symbolic gesture and imitation and movement and meaning. I mean, one of the things, I don't know if you remember this, when we started doing some of the 5 element Qigong, when we started imitating vomiting up old emotional pain, some people actually started vomiting. So it can happen, right? So we start getting into the more shamanic part of state shift and things like that. Breath work induces, I wouldn't call it an inebriation in the sense of being drunk, but a kind of wobbly, weird, like, oh, I don't know, let's see what that would be like.
Mm.
And that spiritual loosening of gears, that spiritual resilience and playfulness and bit of risk taking empowers us to, on the inside, really move some things around somatically and empowers us to really rearrange some of the symbols and stories in the mind by using symbols and stories within the mind to change the story of who is in the mind. And when that starts
Yeah,
to happen, sorry, go ahead.
so like yeah, I could see how like going from like where we started, which is like the shock state to here, that person in the mind would definitely be, well, quite frankly, a completely different person.
Yeah, now you're allowed to be an artist. I remember having this meditation experience. I did this, believe it or not, when I was 18, which is such a weird thing to do at 18, but I committed to a daily evening meditation Chan practice with one of my teachers. So imagine being 18, sacrificing all the stuff that makes 18-year-olds happy for 10 months of sitting on a bench every night in Chan, in the breath, in the stillness, in that way, and staring at a wall and doing all the things that we were training to do. And you have a lot of weird visionary stuff happen when you're in deep, daily, coherent, guided by a terrifyingly, potent human being who's been there, done that. Which gives you a different kind of confidence because now you're being trained kind of like by a Jedi or a monk, but all of that. So when we're in those environments and you're around a lot of other people doing the same thing, and this is pretty measurable around an entrainment, it really loosens things up in a way, for visioning, but it also creates a coherence for profound stillness. So, it's not about just going in there and sitting still and waiting for the TV set of the mind to show you a good sort of movie. It's just blank screen and or whoa, that was a really weird flash of imagery. Somewhere in the middle of all of that training, I had this very strange visionary experience of sitting in meditation, and there was throughout the kind of hour of practice, there's parts where we're using our eyes open, eyes at the wall, eyes on the floor, this, that, or whatever. And we had changed our gaze at some point. I don't remember exactly where. It was like 38 years ago, I think. The vision was me looking over my shoulder, watching me sculpting something with my hands in the meditation hall, practicing. And then I turned the sculpture around and it was my face. But it wasn't my face. It was the face that I probably would have had if I hadn't gone through the stuff that, unfortunately, although very formative me as a person, was also pretty destructive. And the face wasn't really my face. It was the face, and this is sort of a Zen thing, that you would have before you were born, which isn't so much a face, it's just the unformed, undefinable, unreactive self. And it was kind of like a fractal because, if I looked over my shoulder, I would see someone as me watching me in the sense of like the elder wise me. I was 18 at the time, looking at the me meditating, look at the me meditating, sculpting, but in the sense of like the Taoist uncarved block, doing the opposite of trying to fix my identity, just letting it be what it was always in its unformed nature. Right. So when we provide ourselves opportunities to have sort of little visionary, vignettes or escapades, sometimes they're very loaded with meaning, and sometimes they just waste a couple of years because we thought it meant this and it turned out to have meant nothing or meant something else. But that is a part of these traditions and the practices. So we need to go in there and play with the breath work to loosen the gears, to see what the unorganized part of symbol communication within our sentience might show us, or not. Doesn't really matter. But when we start getting into that tangible opportunity of encountering the world in ways that we've never felt it before, we also have the opportunity to do that with the seasons and nature and the weather. Because at a certain point, my teacher used to say this all the time, not the teacher with the meditation course, my Taoist Chinese medicine teacher. He would say all of the time, it's just the weather. It's just the weather. Climate is something you can expect, but weather is always going to be what you get. So
Right.
we all have stories and trajectories and egos, and those are going running whatever script that they're running. But every day, if you're open to it, the weather might shift that. Just like the weather around you, if you're trying to grow tomatoes, may or may not help you with your tomatoes this year.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And when we open up to that and recognize again, Ting Chin, my ability to sense in to what nature's doing in her somewhat capricious and chaotic ways, but also within the balance of say 5 elements or something. Now we're at home in the world, in its balance and flow, and in its kind of chaos and coyote wisdom.
Yeah, like you said with the weather, like I think like episode 13 was definitely something about the weather.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, because things can change.
So now that let's just take a moment. I'm not going to review everything I just said for like an hour, but wow, we have a lot of tools, we have a lot of skills, we have a lot of practices that definitely you could say on a causal level have almost like a medicinal, therapeutic application. So we're now that kind of a practitioner.
Cool.
So now we're going to actually study how rehabilitation and healing works. Because what if there is something that not only has to be met and resolved and released in the energetic level, but what happens if we actually have to repair the body? It's good to be flexible, it's good to have core strength, but what if we need to actually repair something? So we study a little bit of rehabilitation, in the sense of Qigong, in the sense of Chinese medicine, in the sense of, just regular moving practices, warming up for, going to play tag football or frisbee with your friends or whatever. So given that we're now moving into this much more, you could say, slightly clinical, not in the white coat, dry, not an emotional sense of clinical, but in the sense of now I can apply myself to something that has detail, It's like, you could take a wrench and throw it at a car 100 times, and it's not going to fix the car. It's going to make it worse. You've got a wrench, you know what a wrench is. You've got a car, you know what a car is. But if you don't know where the wrench goes and what direction to turn it, you're, you know, literally a monkey with a rock.
Yeah.
So we want to learn to be more skillful, more specific, more interactively aware of what could happen if we got therapeutically, clinically specific. Now, in order to do that, and we'll go back to trauma, we kind of need to learn from a medical clinical point of view. And Chinese medicine has its way of seeing this. Western modern trauma therapy has a way of seeing this, and they're almost the same, different terminology, but the process is the process. So we're going to learn to recognize that we have to come out of shock, we have to downregulate, we have to self-regulate, we have to come into state, we have to Ting Jin, learn to feel our feelings. We need to occupy our body with a sort of therapeutic, balancing, restoring kind of momentum. And then we might notice that it would be kind of fun to occupy the space around us with all of that healing and wholeness. So one part of that is to learn how trauma shuts us down so we can open up in exactly the way that shutting down has shut us down. And that's through what's called neuroceptive interaction, which really has to do with the nature of trust. And, we get into the kind of mechanics, if you will, of how mirroring people in movement, which is a big part of Qigong, martial arts, stuff like that. By imitating another person's movement, you activate mirror neurons, which you had and still have in your brain, but you use them as children to mimic the facial expressions of people around you. So you know how to get fed, you know what a smile means, you know what a frown means. Most of people get the facial expressions figured out, the tone of voice right, and other things like that, so we can communicate our meanings as well as our words. And we can also be intuitive with people because we can see what they're feeling when they're saying something else,
Mm.
right? And this is what's called neuroception, or that's just a technical term for what we call intuition, which means we are getting a sense of information and meaning which isn't being said out loud.
Right. So when people are in these shock states, does that um, faculty kind of just go dormant?
No, I think it just becomes very vigilant to the worst and best things that people can do, which unfortunately makes us as victims of trauma very manipulatable. And this is like there's the meme out there about the narcissist and the empath. The
Hmm.
empath grew up in an environment where they were almost given enough care uh, to be well, but not quite enough, and they had to seek out the problems and the dangers and is my parent drunk today? Do I get fed today? So we have that kind of intuitive hypervigilance. Whereas the narcissist was damaged so early in life that they were damaged before language, in the sense of before they were two. So now they're just like an infant who feels completely entitled to have whatever they want happen around them the way babies do. And they have a seething need for attention and care and stuff like that. And they will screw you up over years and years if you spend enough time with them to get what they want out of you. Because until they realize they have like a black hole of need for care and attention. They think they're just being charismatic and cool to keep your attention. But what they're really trying to do is recover from a profoundly destructive wound.
So
Right.
this is a
So they're,
little bit of a side
sorry, go ahead.
venture, but
Sure.
people that are that damaged that they have to operate in the world in that way. Um, I don't want to ask this question like this, but is there any hope for them?
If they want to be whole and they're willing to go through everything we just talked about, like it's life or death.
Mm,
Because if they want to have a stable, consensual, collaborative, healthy, intimate relationship that isn't just coercive manipulation for the sake of getting your needs met, they're going to have to realize that they have a seething black hole of unvoiceable need because they were abandoned or damaged or wounded in some way as an infant. And this is
mm,
a funny thing. We use the term narcissist like we use the term football player or, fan of soccer or something. because true narcissism isn't that common, right? Narcissistic-like behavior, there's covert narcissism. I mean, I used to teach the psychiatry part of Chinese medicine for years because that's the family tradition I studied in was focused on Qingzhibing, or the psychological part of Chinese medicine. So I'm not going to do that. But the things we often refer to as narcissistic is just so profoundly insecure that they can't not be manipulative to stay in control of connection, which isn't really narcissism. It's just volumes of insecurity and wit.
Right, because like I would say like most of us have both, don't we? We're a bit empathic, we're a bit displaying uh those behaviors. Um
Well, it's getting worse and worse because children are being raised by screens more and more.
mhm, yeah. Let's not go down that rabbit hole.
Let's leave that for another podcast on recovering from the modern dilemma or something. But anyway,
Sounds like a
so
great idea.
here we are. We have our practice. We've learned all the things we just talked about. Now our practice is a little bit about how we occupy space, how we show off, how we express feeling, how we play with body language, tone of voice, facial expression, so that we can recover our innate neuroceptive capacity to be silly, to be expressive, to be iconic, to be powerful, to be shy, to be weird. And then we like play with, say, the shape-shifting, state-shifting practices like the five animals, or, well, there's dozens of, probably, I think there's about 18 different animals that are the most commonly uh, chosen from in China. So we could call that the zoo, and you could pick five, you know, from 2000 years ago, or from whatever lineage of martial arts you're in, or whatever animals you like the most. And in a way, it's a little bit like the way you might think of powwows nowadays. It's kind of like playing dress up in a way. And we run into this dilemma because if you look at the five animal Qigong, online from Beijing, or from modern China, it looks like people trying to be super careful, robotically moving in some very, very minor way, like something with a claw or something with a wing or something with, an animal body. But it's really dry and stoic and boring from my perspective. And that's because I've studied with so many different teachers who taught the shamanic side of this, the visceral qualities of that, the even the martial arts potency of different animals and its visceral capacity to be unbelievably powerful or tricky or agile or quick or whatever, right? So again, we go back to this thing. What we're really wanting to do with five animal frolics is frolic. And the character for Wuqi, frolic means like to put on a funny show for entertainment, right? So the frolicking part is not just an animal by itself, in the woods running around doing animal stuff. It's recognizing you're a person pretending to be a panther, pretending to climb a tree, or to, well, in one paradigm I love to play with, putting mud on the clouds, just because you're in a bad mood and you want to hide more so you can sneak up on your food. So there's lots of fun, like almost indigenous storytelling within Five Animal Frolics. But in the context of therapeutic Qigong is, can you be on a stage, even in your own living room by yourself, and put on a funny show by being expressive of your feelings and your drama and your silliness, and you're allowed to frickin' play again.
In my head, I see you doing the monkey because that one's the funniest one.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So now we
And
can do, go ahead.
for our listeners, like Mike, when he does, I think what do we call it, the ape or
Yeah, the white ape is part of that one I teach. Yeah.
the white ape? Let's just say Mike really gets into it.
Yeah. Mike also used to do a lot of martial arts, and one of my favorite ones for a while was from a style called Bagua Chong, which is usually working in circles, and it doesn't always deal with animals, but one teacher really did a lot of animals. And then we did this drunken monkey Bagua. So imagine running into a crowd of people where you're running around in like figure eights and circles between everyone, attacking them like a drunken monkey. So that's where I fell in love with the monkey thing, because it was madness. And for probably 2 decades as a martial arts teacher within that community of people, if I was ever doing like testing drills with people or push hands or sticky hands from Wing Chun, people would go, "Oh no, I can see it. He's gonna turn into a drunken monkey." And then I would just go crazy and like, oh, and be like a drunken monkey climbing all over their spine and biting their ears,
Yeah.
rolling around on the ground like I was a buffoon. This is like one of the best parts, right? But as we're saying this, and hopefully we're all smiling at this, notice the facial expression of play and imitation and expression. And if we can do all of that, now we can go into like the five element practices and really embody the chi of spring, of something growing in a direction with intention. The idea that we translate wu as wood instead of the tendency of plants to grow upwards and downwards with intention towards water and the sun is a huge loss, because then we just think it's wood.
Mm.
But the experience of reaching towards the sun as you reach down towards the water, that's definitely a chi, a movement that's consistent within nature. In fact, without that, we wouldn't have food. So we learn how to imitate earlier on, to imitate how we hold our cringes and in our fright states. But now we're getting to the point where we're being more expressive, more playful, and we can imitate things like the five elements. And then we go
Nice.
again shape shifting into panthers and bears and tortoises or turtles, more advanced breath work, so we can play more consistently with shape shifting and state shift. And then we get into this other thing is I mean, this goes with the years. So now we're going in from fall into winter. We start learning practices that are called Neanggong, which are things you can do kind of like medical Qigong, or I'm not sure exactly how Reiki works. I've never studied that. But Reiki comes from the Chinese characters Ling Qi, which is what medical Qigong is about. I don't know how similar they are. But we learn Neanggong, or inner nourishing kinds of Qigong, to use our interactive potential to actually heal our organs one at a time, which is a really interesting kind of procedure. And that kind of process shamanism that has a specific interaction, like this organ, that organ in mind, a sort of maybe specific outcome in mind. Now we're actually becoming healers, at least in the sense of sort of self-care and things like that. And then we get to have the even more fun of going into the healing sounds. So I'm just going to ask you, if you don't mind, describe, if you can, and I don't know if you can do this, what you've seen online with the healing sounds.
I haven't looked them up a whole lot, but I've heard you talk about this before, and we've actually had this discussion before about how they're kind of like soft as opposed
Well,
to like,
yeah, I mean, they just kind of go like, oh, wait, and then it's like this one monotone sound,
hmm
and each one, has a movement. It relates to an organ, usually the five, sort of solid organs plus the gallbladder or other things, depending on the tradition. There's three different schools of six healing sounds, and they're sort of similar but different, and all of that. So if we're looking at that, that's a good start. But when we learned it, and I'm sort of leading you to help me with something, what did we do?
feel into the actual like place, and then we try and like vibrate it with sound, but
Uh,
it's more intense.
yeah, you've been into a sweat lodge, right?
Been into a sweat lodge.
Yeah. What's the singing like in a sweat lodge?
Um, yeah, it's which episode was that? Episode one of the episodes that me and Mike did, I had a little knot in my stomach and I was hearing the Sundance sounds and then feeling how they would actually come from like that butterflies at the stomach place. And actually so like the wailing is like it's literally like it's like grief. It's like you're going to the place where the pain is and you're expressing it in these sounds.
Yeah. So if we're going to talk about healing the, say, five organs, six healing sounds, or, that kind of stuff, and I'm trying to be playful with words, but really make a point. You'd think it might want to be a bit visceral to help you with your viscera.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when I was studying that with different teachers, that was the thing is let's get the pattern, the movement, the sound, um, so that we have a practice. And now, especially either in groups that you feel good about doing this with, um, can you do it viscerally?
Mm.
And can you express what you actually need to express emotionally with that kind of visceral intensity, or at least emotional expression?
Yeah.
And then in that course, we do a couple of other things. One is learning about what's called a microcosmic orbit, which is unfortunately turned into a kind of traffic process in the West, because I don't know, I guess it's predictable enough and consistent enough and easy enough to learn that. And because we think of chi as energy, as a thing in a place that needs to go in the right places and around acupuncture and stuff, it's not like some huge dilemma or whatever. It's just not the safest thing to do. And it doesn't have any of the interactive potentials or benefits when you just choo-choo train chi around your spine and down the front of your body. Because
Mm-hmm.
there's way, way more opportunities. And, you and I are doing that right now. There's 16 different passes to the Xiaojuetian, the microcosmic orbit, and none of them have to do with moving chi anywhere.
Yeah, it's I think the principle is wu wei.
Yeah.
It's kind of just allowing.
Yeah.
It's
And
like
just
all.
noticing the relationships for what they already are.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Like,
So, sorry, go ahead.
which are relationships.
And then the last thing we do is we get into the beginning of the Negong practice, which from the tradition I studied in, which is a Chinese medicine Taoist practice tradition, not just a monastic tradition. The focus is on spiritual recapitulation, like in the sense of your life within who your innate self is and what's kind of been done or done to you or through you in some way. So you can recapitulate these wounds consciously and spiritually, uh, as a spiritual being, not as an ego or an identity. And that's where we kind of get into playing with a little bit of healing the wounds of your ancestors and coming to recognize that the story of you is not in any way more valuable than your capacity to be in the coherent state, as a somewhat awakened or somewhat present conscious being, not as a person with a story and a name and a resume.
And there's such a profound need for that this day and age
Mhm.
to be present. Like yeah, it's almost a superpower these days.
So anyway, just throwing that out there, that's the process that course goes through for people. And I don't know, for the listeners, I mean, that's a lot to take in and maybe just try and follow along with. But if you are a practitioner, if you're a healer, or a therapist, or someone who really wants to teach a complete system of Qigong in that therapeutic, like not just move and exercise in the basic sense, but really go in there and solve problems, that's what that course is for. Oh yeah, and it starts late May, early June this year.
Cool.
Yeah, 10 months, full on, step by step. Gots to land a helicopter if you're not in shock, but if you're in shock, maybe come out of that panic attack first.
And I would say it's a pretty thorough toolkit because like as we're even talking, I'm like, okay, so I guess I'm on my third year of my Qigong journey. And it's like, okay, like as we're talking, I'm like, there's a few things that I still haven't really played with a whole lot in there. And I'm like, oh, okay, like healing sounds. I'm gonna go and kind of play with those a little bit. And so it's like yeah, it's a pretty good toolbox in my estimation. Is there anything in there that's like that really when you first learned it that really wowed you?
I think the thing that wowed me the most is I mean, so I studied in what you might call an oral tradition, although things were written down. They were written down word for word from what, the kind of patriarch or progenitor of And he was a 14th generation father to son doctor of Chinese medicine, specific lineage of Taoist practice that's more of a village tradition. Before that, they were proponents of the Shangqing in that part of China lineage of Taoism for probably 1,000 years. And uh, because he was a fairly well known, or his family was fairly well known, they were kind of given the goods about the Communist Revolution and kind of what was likely to happen. So they left China and went to Hong Kong, probably I think 2 years before, stuff went down. So they're one of the, rare, families who left China and kept everything intact. But when they went to Hong Kong, his job being to like, be a acupuncture Chinese doctor or professor guy, he was teaching in 3 different Chinese medicine schools in Hong Kong, and then he was invited to like try and show the Western doctors in that part of China, like this is acupuncture, this is what we do. And then he got into neurology a bit. He didn't go to school to be an MD. He just started studying like how does Western medicine look at the brain and neurotransmitters and stuff. And back then it was pretty, you know, pretty rudimentary. But he just became a really big fan of understanding it in the sense of Chinese medicine and Western medicine, which is so rare to meet a lineage holding oral tradition doctor of Chinese medicine and, carrier of a Taoist practice to say, oh yeah, and this was his words. The only difference between Western medicine and Chinese medicine is semantics.
Hmm.
And he also had this thing about and, like it's always this and that. If it's Chinese medicine or Western medicine, someone's wrong. And obviously,
Hmm.
we're talking about the same thing in the same way. We just assess it differently or measure it differently.
Yeah, that's a profound thing to say by a lineage holding teacher, hey?
Yeah. So, I mean, that for me, that when you asked it, I was like, I think the most stunning thing to me was like, here I am. I finally found a lineage. I finally found the old stuff. I finally found something. And this is something else he would say is don't trust anything about Chinese medicine that was written after 1742.
I want to say like bottom ching.
Because the Jesuits were having a hard time converting Chinese people into whatever Jesuits do with Christianity or whatever. And it was because there was no literal afterlife in China. There was kind of affirmational stories about and where the immortals go and what the ancestors are doing. But because it's not a literal language or a literal culture, it was all considered to be kind of, oh, that's a cool way to look at it.
Hmm.
Whereas in the West, people actually have the belief that your physical soul, like Casper the Ghost, is going to come out of your body and go and live in a place in the sky with a guy who runs the whole thing. And you better be good or you're not going to get in. You're going to go to this other place where it's literally hell. I mean, literally, because you're going to go to hell, whatever you think hell is, right? So that's a great thing if you can make people buy into that paradigm. But what if people don't think nouns are that interesting?
Hmm.
You don't have a physical unit of soul. You have this manifold thing of different kinds of souls like Hunpo and all this other stuff that goes back to the indigenous people of China. So if you can't get people to be afraid of what happens to their soul, how are you going to make them show up to church every day and give you money? This is what they did. I mean, you can research this.
Yeah.
They started concentrating oxygen out of the atmosphere because they were just getting basic chemistry at that point, and that they could burn the oxygen in a way that produced this very specific colored flame. And that color has a certain meaning in China. So, oh my God, you have concentrated qi out of the air and made it this kind of qi. So, wait a minute, maybe this whole God, heaven, hell thing's for reals. Maybe we should join their church. And now Chinese medicine is writing about itself since then about, well, qi is this and it goes there and it has this. And now we have colonized Chinese medicine in China.
Yeah. So like it's kind of like intellectualizing it, right? Because instead of working at it from like the felt experience or like the sensation, we're kind of like this is what it is,
Yeah, you need this thing in this place and more is better.
right? Because I think about like acupuncture and how it's like in a book and it's like okay, put that needle in this point. But it's like that practitioner kind of needs to be refined enough in their own being to be able to sense like where in that point is the chi stuck so I can actually put the needle in the right place.
Yeah, that's a pretty new age way of looking at it. But yeah,
Okay.
Circulation is circulation. It's like seeping water moving through land. If there's a bunch of rocks and the seeping of innate circulation, which you can't magically change how it works, you can make the membrane system locally and interactively across systems throughout the body circulate better, but you can't take one thing and push it through other things in some way that somehow sidesteps what's actually happening in the body. And that's the noun dilemma of qi. And on a certain level, qi is definitely a substrate of interaction. Whether or not you can put it in a jar is kind of a funny story.
I've heard that funny story.
Yeah, we'll leave that funny story for later because you got to go.
Yeah, we got a little bit of time.
So, given that we're living in contemporary busy lives, both of us have a couple of places to go. Um, so I would just encourage anyone who's listened to this to, if you want to, there'll be a link in the description or show notes underneath of it. And just look through the table of contents, if you want to just sort of track back in your mind all the things we went through, because it's a 10-month course. There's a lot to it. Um, I don't think everyone in the world needs to take this course in the sense like you're going to be missing out on some, fundamental thing if you didn't do it. But again, if you are a practitioner, a teacher, a clinician, someone who's experienced I don't know, rougher parts of life, this would be a really good approach to take. And if you can find another thing that's similar, that's more interesting, I just want to encourage people that you have to have a process to make progress. And you need to have a guide who understands that process because they've been through it themselves, and preferably try and find someone who went through that process because they needed to, right?
hmm
I mean, I got into this stuff because I was, on the journey I was on, but I also needed to go through the therapeutic healing process and all of these other things because my life up until then was not optimal. So if you're looking for a way to learn these things, that's the best advice I could have you is find someone who's gone through things. They have a process that makes progress. It makes sense. And if possible, it makes sense both in Chinese medicine, say Taoist practice, Buddhist practice, and in modern neuroscience and, stress physiology and stuff like that. Because then there's no one standing on any kind of tightrope of a belief. We're just pragmatically looking for tools that we can put into place to resolve things that might benefit us in some way. I've
hmm
been I've been doing the doctor thing almost 30 years and training doctors for most of that time. So I'm fairly confident in the way I organize things, the way I, maybe shift around things that I learn from teachers so contemporary people can get things in the way that Westerners would get the most benefit from.
hmm
But that's just the way I do it. So I'm confident in my approach because I've been doing it for as long as I have in the ways that I have, but I'm not in any way suggesting that it's the only way or the best way. It's just what makes the most sense given the attributes and toolboxes I've come across. But if you can find a way in whatever background you have that moves people through that trajectory that we've talked about today, then you're doing what it is that you would need to do in the order that tends to work for people.
And just a little bit of feedback from myself from taking this course. Um, it was so cool to have like, first of all, that blueprint of like the actual um kind of like how you down regulate from the shock state and just to know what that is. And and yeah, it was definitely the Q&A and A and just having that group of people. So it's like
Mm.
it was a very caring and compassionate course. So
Yep.
thank you, Mike, because like at that point in my life, that's what I really needed. So just yeah, big thanks to you um and for some of our listeners too. Like yeah, it's a good one. But I guess we should put a trigger warning because
Yeah, that course is, yeah, you want to be ready to heal.
to go into some things. Alrighty, well, thank you so much, Mike. As always, it's so fun and such a pleasure to do this with you. And yeah, so episode 15. Who needs therapeutic Qigong? Thank you, everyone. And yeah, like, comment, subscribe, and do all of those things. We love the feedback so we can kind of make better episodes, um, or different episodes for y'all. Any
Thank
last
you
words,
all.
Mike?
And thank you all for listening. And I hope that's given those who needed it a bit of a map from where you might be stuck to where you might be you again.
Thank you for exploring and enjoying Primordial Tao, Present Tao. We look forward to sharing more in the next episode.